Imagine being abandoned by your own family and still carrying a secret that could change everything. You won't believe what this elderly woman revealed. You may think this is just another sob story, but her secret will make your jaw drop. In the heart of a wealthy California neighborhood, where manicured lawns stretched like emerald carpets and towering palm trees swayed gently in the warm breeze, there stood a mansion unlike any other. Its elegant facade, all gleaming white stone and intricate ironwork, belied the cold emptiness that lurked within its walls. This was the home of Evelyn Harris, a once formidable businesswoman now in her late 70s, living out her days in isolation, cut off from the world she once conquered. Before we dive deeper, drop a comment below and let me know where you're watching from. I'm always curious to hear from you. As the golden California sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the sprawling estate, Evelyn sat alone in her study, a glass of untouched whiskey at her elbow. The room, like the rest of the house, was a testament to wealth and refined taste. Priceless art adorned the walls, antique furniture filled every corner, and shelves lined with leather-bound books spoke of a lifetime of accumulation. Yet, for all its opulence, the room felt as hollow as its sole occupant. Evelyn's gaze drifted to the large bay window, where she could see her reflection superimposed over the darkening garden beyond. Time had etched deep lines into her once flawless face, and her steel-gray hair was pulled back into a severe bun, a style she had maintained for decades. Her piercing blue eyes, once sharp with ambition, now held a weariness that no amount of success could erase. The silence of the house pressed in on her, broken only by the ticking of an antique grandfather clock in the hallway, its steady rhythm a mocking reminder of the relentless passage of time. Evelyn's days were marked by this silence, punctuated only by the quiet comings and goings of her small staff, a housekeeper, a cook, and a part-time gardener. They moved through the mansion like ghosts, efficient and unobtrusive, their presence doing little to alleviate the crushing loneliness that had become Evelyn's constant companion. As she sat there, lost in thought, Evelyn's mind wandered to her family, or rather the absence of it. Her children and grandchildren, scattered across the country, were strangers to her now. It had been years since they last crossed the threshold of the mansion, their absence a stark reminder of the choices Evelyn had made throughout her life. She could still remember the last time they had all been together, at her husband Robert's funeral 10 years ago. The memory surfaced unbidden, sharp and painful. The church had been full, a testament to Robert's charm and the connections he had cultivated over the years. Evelyn had stood at the front, dry-eyed and rigid, while her children, Michael, Sarah, and Thomas, sat in the pew behind her, their faces etched with grief and something else, resentment. After the service, as mourners offered condolences, Evelyn had overheard a snippet of conversation between Sarah and Thomas. "I can't believe her," Sarah had whispered, her voice tight with anger. "Even now, she can't show an ounce of emotion. It's like she's made of stone." Thomas had simply shaken his head, his expression a mixture of sadness and resignation. "What did you expect? She's always been like this. Work first, family, well, somewhere down the list." The words had stung, but Evelyn had pushed the pain aside, burying it deep within herself as she had done countless times before. She had built her empire on the foundation of emotional detachment, and old habits died hard. Now, a decade later, those words echoed in her mind, a harsh reminder of the wall she had built between herself and those who should have been closest to her. Evelyn Harris, the woman who had climbed to the top of the business world, who had brokered deals worth billions and brought entire corporations to their knees, found herself at the end of her life with an empire of wealth and not a soul to share it with. As the last rays of sunlight faded from the sky, Evelyn rose from her chair, her movement slow and deliberate. She made her way across the room to a large mahogany desk, its surface meticulously organized. With trembling hands, she opened the top drawer and pulled out a stack of photographs, each one carefully preserved in a plastic sleeve. Settling back into her chair, Evelyn began to flip through the images, each one a window into a past that seemed to belong to someone else. There was Michael on his 5th birthday, cake smeared across his chubby cheeks, his eyes bright with laughter. Sarah at her high school graduation, her smile forced as she stood stiffly next to Evelyn. Thomas cradling his newborn daughter, looking up at the camera with a mixture of joy and exhaustion. As she looked at the photos, Evelyn felt something stir within her chest, a faint ache that she had long ago learned to ignore. It was regret, she realized, a feeling so foreign that it took her a moment to recognize it. Regret for the birthdays she had missed, the school plays she had skipped, the family dinners she had been too busy to attend. Regret for the times she had chosen a board meeting over a bedtime story, a business trip over a family vacation. The weight of these missed moments pressed down on her, heavier than any business decision she had ever made. Evelyn Harris, who had prided herself on always making the right choice, was forced to confront the possibility that perhaps, in the areas that mattered most, she had been tragically wrong. As she sat there, surrounded by the trappings of her success yet utterly alone, Evelyn felt the first crack in the emotional armor she had worn for so long. A single tear slipped down her cheek, falling onto the photograph in her hand, a family portrait taken years ago, before the rifts had grown too wide to bridge. The sound of footsteps in the hallway startled Evelyn from her reverie. Hastily, she wiped away the tear and straightened her posture, slipping back into the role of the unflappable matriarch. A soft knock at the door preceded the entrance of Claire, her caretaker, and the closest thing Evelyn had to a confidant. Claire, a woman in her mid-50s with kind eyes and a gentle demeanor, entered the room carrying a tray with Evelyn's evening medication and a glass of water. She paused, taking in the sight of the usually composed Mrs. Harris surrounded by old photographs. "Is everything all right, Mrs. Harris?" Claire asked, her voice laced with genuine concern. Evelyn cleared her throat, attempting to regain her usual air of detachment. "Yes, of course. Just reviewing some old memories." Claire set the tray down on a nearby table and moved closer, her eyes falling on the scattered photographs. A soft smile played at her lips as she picked up one of a young boy laughing on a swing. "Is this your son, Michael?" Evelyn nodded, surprised by the lump that formed in her throat at the mention of her firstborn. "Yes, that's Michael. He was about 7 in that picture, I believe." "He has your eyes," Claire observed gently. "Do you speak with him often?" The question, innocent as it was, struck Evelyn like a physical blow. She turned away, unable to meet Claire's gaze. "No," she admitted after a long moment. "I haven't spoken to any of my children since Robert passed." Claire's sharp intake of breath was the only indication of her surprise. In all the years she had worked for Mrs. Harris, this was the most personal information the older woman had ever shared. Sensing a rare moment of vulnerability, Claire decided to press gently. "Mrs. Harris." "Evelyn," she began, using her employer's first name for the first time. "May I speak freely?" Evelyn looked up, startled by the use of her given name but too weary to object. She nodded, bracing herself for whatever Claire might say. "In all the time I've known you, I've never seen you look at anything the way you're looking at those photos," Claire said softly. "It's clear how much you care about your family. Have you considered reaching out to them?" Evelyn's first instinct was to bristle at the suggestion, to remind Claire of her place and end the conversation. But something, perhaps the weight of her earlier reflections, or simply the fatigue of maintaining her walls, made her pause. "They wouldn't want to hear from me," Evelyn said at last, her voice barely above a whisper. "I've made too many mistakes, been absent for too long. Some bridges once burned can't be rebuilt." Claire took a seat across from Evelyn, her posture open and encouraging. "With all due respect, Mrs. Harris, I don't believe that's true. It's never too late to try and make things right. Family. Family is precious, and from what I've seen, it's the only thing that truly matters in the end." Evelyn's gaze drifted back to the photographs, lingering on the faces of her children, so young and full of promise. She thought of all the years that had passed, the milestones she had missed, the relationships that had withered under the weight of her neglect. And for the first time in longer than she could remember, Evelyn Harris felt a glimmer of something she had long ago abandoned. Hope. "Perhaps," she began, her voice heavy with emotion. "Perhaps you're right, Claire. But there's something I've never told anyone. Something that might change everything." Claire leaned forward, her expression a mixture of curiosity and concern. "What is it, Mrs. Harris?" Evelyn stood, moving with a purpose she hadn't felt in years. She walked to a large painting on the far wall, a stormy seascape that had always reminded her of the turbulent emotions she kept locked away. With trembling hands, she lifted the painting from its hooks, revealing a small safe embedded in the wall behind it. As Claire watched in amazement, Evelyn entered a combination and opened the safe. From within, she withdrew a leather-bound journal, its pages yellowed with age and its cover worn from years of handling. Clutching the journal to her chest, Evelyn returned to her seat, her eyes never leaving the book in her hands. "This," Evelyn said, her voice barely above a whisper, "contains a secret I've kept for over 40 years, a secret that has shaped every decision I've made, every wall I've built." With shaking hands, Evelyn opened the journal, revealing pages filled with elegant, flowing script. Claire leaned forward, her curiosity piqued by this unexpected turn of events. "Before I became who I am today," Evelyn began, her voice gaining strength as she spoke, "I was a different person, young, idealistic, and in love." As Evelyn began to read from the journal, her voice transported them both to a different time, a different place. The story that unfolded was one of passion, heartbreak, and a decision that would alter the course of her life forever. In her youth, long before she became the cold, calculating businesswoman the world knew, Evelyn had fallen deeply in love with a man named James. He was everything her family disapproved of, an artist with no fortune to his name and dreams that seemed impossibly large. But to Evelyn, he was her whole world. Their love affair was intense and all-consuming. For the first time in her life, Evelyn felt truly alive, free from the suffocating expectations of her wealthy family. But their happiness was short-lived. When Evelyn discovered she was pregnant, her family's reaction was swift and merciless. Threatened with disinheritance and the ruin of James's fledgling career, Evelyn was forced to make an impossible choice. Torn between her love for James and the child growing within her, and the weight of her family's legacy, Evelyn chose the path that would haunt her for the rest of her life. She left James, breaking both their hearts in the process. She hid her pregnancy from the world, secluded in a private estate, until she gave birth to a beautiful baby girl. And then, with a pain she thought would kill her, she gave her daughter up for adoption. As Evelyn read the words she had written so long ago, tears flowed freely down her cheeks. Claire listened in stunned silence, witnessing the unraveling of a lifetime of carefully guarded secrets. "I never told anyone," Evelyn said, her voice breaking. "Not my parents, not Robert when I married him years later, not my other children. I buried the pain, threw myself into building my empire. I thought if I could just be successful enough, powerful enough, it would fill the void left by my daughter. But it never did." Claire reached out, grasping Evelyn's hand in a gesture of comfort. "Oh, Evelyn," she breathed, using her first name without hesitation. "I'm so sorry. What an incredible burden to carry all these years." Evelyn nodded, feeling lighter than she had in decades, despite the weight of her confession. "The journal is full of letters I wrote to her over the years. Letters I never sent. Every birthday, every Christmas, every milestone I imagined she might be reaching. I wrote to her, told her about my life, asked about hers. It was my way of keeping her close, even though she was lost to me." As the night deepened around them, Evelyn continued to share her story, reading passages from the journal that chronicled her journey from a heartbroken young woman to the business titan she became. With each word, each shared memory, she felt the walls she had built around her heart beginning to crumble. Claire listened intently, offering words of comfort and understanding. As the first light of dawn began to creep through the windows, she asked the question that hung heavily in the air. "Have you ever thought about finding her?" Evelyn closed the journal gently. Text here. "Never having tried to make things right." "All right," she said at last, her voice gaining strength with each word. "All right, let's do it. Let's find her." Claire beamed, squeezing Evelyn's hand encouragingly. "That's wonderful, Evelyn. We'll start right away. I know a private investigator who's discreet and thorough. We'll find her, I promise you. As Claire bustled about, making calls and setting things in motion, Evelyn remained seated, the journal clutched to her chest. She felt as though she was standing on the edge of a precipice, about to take a leap into the unknown. But for the first time in longer than she could remember, she also felt something else: hope. The next few weeks passed in a blur of activity. The private investigator, a no-nonsense woman named Sandra, set to work with a determination that impressed even Evelyn. She scoured adoption records, followed paper trails, and pursued every lead, no matter how slim. As they waited for news, Evelyn found herself opening up more to Claire, sharing stories of her past that she had kept locked away for so long. She spoke of her childhood, of the pressure to succeed that had been placed on her shoulders from a young age. She talked about James, about the depth of their love and the agony of their parting, and she shared her regrets, the missed birthdays, the skipped recitals, the family dinners sacrificed at the altar of her ambition. Claire listened without judgment, offering comfort and understanding. Slowly, Evelyn felt the ice around her heart beginning to thaw, years of pent-up emotion finally finding release. As days turned into weeks, Evelyn found herself experiencing a range of emotions she had long suppressed. Hope warred with fear, excitement with dread. She spent hours poring over the journal, rereading the letters she had written to her unknown daughter, imagining the life she might have led. One particularly restless night, as Evelyn sat in her study unable to sleep, she found herself drawn to the phone. Before she could talk herself out of it, she dialed a number she hadn't called in years. "Hello?" A groggy voice answered after several rings. Evelyn's breath caught in her throat. "Michael? It's your mother." There was a long pause on the other end of the line, so long that Evelyn feared her son had hung up. Then, "Mom, is everything okay?" "It's the middle of the night." The concern in his voice, however reluctant, brought tears to Evelyn's eyes. "Yes, everything's fine. I wanted to hear your voice. I know it's late and I'm sorry for that. I've been doing a lot of thinking lately about the past, about our family. I miss you, Michael." The silence that followed was heavy with years of unspoken words and buried hurts. When Michael finally spoke, his voice was guarded, but not unkind. "It's been a long time, Mom. A lot has happened." "I know," Evelyn said, her voice thick with emotion. "And I know I have no right to expect anything from you. But if you're willing, I'd like a chance to talk, to explain some things and maybe try to make amends." There was another pause, shorter this time. "I don't know, Mom. It's not just me. Sarah and Thomas. We've all been hurt." Evelyn nodded, even though her son couldn't see her. "I understand. And I want to talk to them too. All of you. There's something important I need to tell you. Something I should have shared a long time ago. But I'll respect whatever decision you make." Michael sighed, a sound that seemed to carry the weight of years. "Let me think about it, okay? I'll talk to Sarah and Thomas. I can't promise anything, but I'll think about it." "That's all I can ask," Evelyn said, relief flooding through her. "Thank you, Michael. And I'm sorry for waking you. Sleep well." As she hung up the phone, Evelyn felt a mixture of hope and trepidation. It wasn't much, but it was a start. A tiny crack in the wall that had separated her from her children for so long. The next morning, as Evelyn shared the details of the late-night call with Claire, they were interrupted by the shrill ring of the telephone. It was Sandra, the private investigator, her voice tight with excitement. "Mrs. Harris, I think we found her. Your daughter. Her name is Grace Thompson, and she lives in a small town in Ohio." The world seemed to tilt on its axis as Evelyn absorbed the news. Grace. Her daughter had a name, a life, a home. She was real, no longer just a dream or a regret, but a living, breathing person. What do we know about her?" Evelyn asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Sandra shared what she had discovered. Grace was 57 years old, married with 2 children of her own. She worked as a high school English teacher and was well respected in her community. She had never sought out her birth parents, content with the loving family that had adopted her. As Evelyn listened to the details of her daughter's life, she felt a complex mix of emotions. Pride in the woman Grace had become, sadness for all the years they had missed, fear of disrupting the life she had built. "What do you want to do, Mrs. Harris?" Sandra asked gently. "I can arrange a meeting if you'd like, or we can simply provide you with more information. The choice is yours." Evelyn closed her eyes, her mind racing. This was the moment she had both longed for and dreaded for decades. The chance to reconnect with the child she had given up, to explain, to seek forgiveness. But it was also a moment fraught with risk. What if Grace wanted nothing to do with her? What if this revelation destroyed the tentative hope of reconciliation with her other children? As she stood on this precipice of decision, Evelyn felt the weight of her years, the accumulation of choices made and paths not taken. She thought of the young woman she had once been, frightened and alone, making an impossible choice. She thought of the business titan she had become, building an empire on the foundation of her buried pain. And she thought of the woman she was now, older, perhaps wiser, and finally ready to face the truth of her past. With a deep breath, Evelyn opened her eyes, meeting Claire's supportive gaze. "I want to meet her," she said, her voice steady despite the trembling of her hands. "I want to meet my daughter." The decision made, events began to move quickly. Sandra reached out to Grace through an intermediary, explaining the situation with sensitivity and discretion. Days passed in agonizing slowness as Evelyn waited for a response, her nerves frayed and her emotions raw. When the call finally came, Evelyn was in her study, staring out at the manicured gardens that suddenly seemed meaningless in the face of this monumental moment. Claire answered the phone, her face lighting up as she listened to the voice on the other end. "Mrs. Harris," she said, her voice trembling with excitement. "It's Grace. She's agreed to meet with you." Evelyn's heart seemed to stop for a moment before racing ahead at double speed. She reached for the phone with shaking hands, pressing it to her ear as if it were a lifeline. "Hello?" she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Mrs. Harris?" The voice on the other end was warm, with a slight Midwestern lilt. "This is Grace Thompson. I believe you've been looking for me." Tears sprang to Evelyn's eyes at the sound of her daughter's voice. "Yes," she managed to choke out. "Yes, I have. For a very long time." There was a pause, filled with the weight of decades of separation and unspoken words. Then Grace spoke again, her voice gentle but firm. "I have to admit, this came as quite a shock. I've always known I was adopted, but I never felt the need to seek out my birth parents. My mom and dad, my adoptive parents. They gave me a wonderful life." "I'm so glad," Evelyn said, meaning it with every fiber of her being. "That's all I ever wanted for you." "Mrs. Harris," Grace began, then paused. "I'm not sure what to call you." "Evelyn," she supplied quickly. "Please, call me Evelyn." "Evelyn," Grace repeated, the name sounding strange yet familiar on her tongue. "I have a lot of questions. I'm sure you do too. I think I'd like to meet you if that's all right, to hear your story and to share mine. But I want you to understand. I have a family, a life. I'm not looking to fill any void or to suddenly have a new mother. I'm curious, and I think perhaps we both might find some peace in talking, but I can't promise anything beyond that. Is that okay?" Evelyn nodded, forgetting for a moment that Grace couldn't see her. "Yes," she said aloud, her voice thick with emotion. "Yes, that's more than okay. It's more than I ever dared to hope for. Thank you, Grace. Thank you for being willing to meet with me." They made arrangements to meet the following week at a neutral location, a quiet cafe in a town halfway between their homes. As Evelyn hung up the phone, she felt as though a great weight had been lifted from her shoulders, only to be replaced by a new kind of nervous energy. The days leading up to the meeting passed in a blur of anticipation and preparation. Evelyn spent hours poring over her old journal, refreshing her memory of the thoughts and feelings she had poured onto its pages over the years. She selected photos to bring, of herself as a young woman, of James, of the life she had built, and she steeled herself for the difficult conversations that lay ahead. The night before the meeting, Evelyn received another unexpected call. It was Michael again, his voice cautious but not unfriendly. "Mom, I talked to Sarah and Thomas. We've been doing a lot of thinking, and we'd like to come see you. To talk, if that offer still stands." Evelyn's heart soared at her son's words, even as a new wave of anxiety washed over her. "Of course it does, Michael. I'd love to see you all. There's something important I need to tell you. Something that might help explain a lot of things." "Okay," Michael said, a note of curiosity creeping into his voice. "How about next weekend? We can all come to the house, if that's all right." "That would be perfect," Evelyn replied, her mind already racing ahead to how she would share her long-held secret with her children. "I'll look forward to it." As she hung up the phone, Evelyn felt as though she was standing on the edge of a new beginning. The past and the present were colliding, long-buried truths rising to the surface. It was terrifying and exhilarating all at once. The morning of her meeting with Grace dawned bright and clear, as if the universe itself was acknowledging the significance of the day. Evelyn dressed with care, choosing an outfit that was elegant yet approachable. She tucked the journal and the photos into a leather portfolio, her hands lingering on the worn cover that had held her secrets for so long. Claire drove her to the cafe, offering words of encouragement and support along the way. As they pulled into the parking lot, Evelyn's nerves threatened to overwhelm her. She took a deep breath, centering herself as she had done countless times before high-stakes business meetings. But this, she knew, was infinitely more important than any deal she had ever brokered. "You'll be fine," Claire said softly, giving Evelyn's hand a reassuring squeeze. "Just speak from your heart. That's all anyone can ask." Evelyn nodded, summoning every ounce of courage she possessed. With one last deep breath, she stepped out of the car and walked towards the cafe entrance. And there, waiting just inside the door, was a woman with familiar eyes that Evelyn recognized from her own reflection. "Grace," she breathed, her heart pounding in her chest. The woman turned, her gaze meeting Evelyn's. For a moment, time seemed to stand still as mother and daughter saw each other for the first time in over 5 decades. Then Grace smiled, a small, tentative gesture that nonetheless filled Evelyn with hope. "Hello, Evelyn," Grace said softly. "It's nice to meet you." As they made their way to a quiet table in the corner, Evelyn felt as though she was stepping into a new chapter of her life. The path ahead was uncertain, filled with potential for both joy and heartache. But for the first time in longer than she could remember, Evelyn Harris felt truly alive, ready to face whatever lay ahead with an open heart and the courage to embrace the truth. The conversation that followed was unlike any Evelyn had ever experienced. As she and Grace sat across from each other, steaming cups of coffee between them, the years seemed to melt away. Evelyn found herself pouring out her story, the passionate love she had shared with James, the impossible choice she had been forced to make, the years of regret and longing that had followed. Grace listened intently, her expression a mixture of empathy and curiosity. When Evelyn finished speaking, her voice hoarse from the outpouring of emotion, Grace reached across the table and took her hand. "Thank you for sharing that with me," she said softly. "I can't imagine how difficult it must have been for you all these years." Evelyn felt tears welling up in her eyes. "I've thought about you every day," she confessed. "Wondered where you were, what you were doing, if you were happy. I want you to know that giving you up was the hardest thing I've ever done. And if I could go back, knowing what I know now, I would have made a different choice." Grace squeezed her hand gently. "I understand," she said, "and I want you to know that I've had a good life. My parents, my adoptive parents, they loved me fiercely. They gave me every opportunity, supported me in every way. I've never felt unwanted or unloved." Relief washed over Evelyn at these words. "I'm so glad," she said, meaning it with every fiber of her being. "That's all I ever wanted for you." As the hours passed, they shared stories of their lives. Grace told Evelyn about her childhood in Ohio, her decision to become a teacher, her marriage to her high school sweetheart, and the joy of raising her own children. Evelyn, in turn, shared more about her life, her rise in the business world, her marriage to Robert, and the complicated relationships she had with her other children. I made a lot of mistakes, Evelyn admitted, her voice heavy with regret. After I lost you, I threw myself into my work. I thought if I could just be successful enough, powerful enough, it would fill the void. But it never did. And in the process, I pushed away the people who should have been closest to me. Grace nodded, her expression thoughtful. Have you told them about me? She asked gently. Evelyn shook her head. Not yet. They're coming to see me next weekend. I plan to tell them then. I'm terrified, to be honest. I don't know how they'll react. It won't be easy, Grace acknowledged. But from what you've told me, it sounds like they're open to rebuilding your relationship. This might be a chance for all of you to start fresh, with everything out in the open. As their meeting drew to a close, both women felt the weight of the moment. They had taken the first steps on a journey neither had expected, and the path ahead was uncertain. I'd like to stay in touch, Grace said as they prepared to leave. I can't promise what our relationship will look like, but I'd like to get to know you better. And maybe, in time, meet my siblings. Evelyn felt her heart swell with hope. I'd like that very much, she said, her voice thick with emotion. Thank you, Grace, for listening, for understanding, for giving me a chance. As they parted ways, Evelyn felt as though a great weight had been lifted from her shoulders. The secret she had carried for so long was finally out in the open, at least to the person who mattered most. And while she knew there were still difficult conversations ahead with her other children, she felt better equipped to face them now. The drive back to the mansion was quiet, Claire sensing Evelyn's need for reflection. As they pulled up to the grand house, Evelyn looked at it with new eyes. The cold, imposing structure that had been her sanctuary and her prison for so long now seemed full of possibility. Thank you, Claire, she said as they entered the house. For everything. I couldn't have done this without you. Claire smiled warmly. You're stronger than you know, Evelyn. And I have a feeling this is just the beginning of a beautiful new chapter in your life. As the week progressed, Evelyn threw herself into preparations for her children's visit. She had meals planned, rooms prepared, and most importantly, she rehearsed how she would share her long-held secret. The nerves were still there, but they were tempered now by a sense of purpose and hope. The day of the visit dawned bright and clear. Evelyn stood at the window of her study, watching as a car pulled up the long driveway. Her heart raced as she saw Michael step out, followed by Sarah and Thomas. They looked older than she remembered, of course, but still so familiar. Her children, finally home. Taking a deep breath, Evelyn made her way to the foyer. As the door opened and her children stepped inside, she felt a rush of emotion so strong it nearly overwhelmed her. Welcome home, she said softly, her voice wavering slightly. I'm so glad you're here. The initial greetings were awkward, years of distance making even the simplest interactions feel strange. But as they moved to the sitting room, the tension began to ease. They talked about their lives, catching up on years of missed moments. Evelyn listened more than she spoke, drinking in every detail of her children's lives. Finally, as the conversation lulled, Evelyn knew it was time. There's something I need to tell you, she began, her heart pounding in her chest. Something I should have told you long ago. Her children exchanged glances, curiosity and apprehension evident in their expressions. What is it, Mom? Michael asked, leaning forward slightly. Evelyn took a deep breath, steadying herself. Before I married your father, before I became the person you knew growing up, I had another child, a daughter. The silence that followed her words was deafening. Sarah's eyes widened in shock, Thomas's brow furrowed in confusion, and Michael sat perfectly still, his face unreadable. What do you mean? You had another child? Sarah finally asked, her voice barely above a whisper. And so, Evelyn began her story. She told them about James, about the impossible choice she had been forced to make, about the daughter she had given up for adoption. She spoke of the grief that had shaped her, the walls she had built around her heart, the drive for success that had been born from her loss. As she spoke, tears flowed freely down her cheeks, years of pent-up emotion finally finding release. Her children listened in stunned silence, their own eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I know this doesn't excuse the mistakes I've made," Evelyn said, her voice hoarse from the outpouring of emotion. "But I hope it helps you understand. The coldness, the distance. It wasn't because I didn't love you. It was because I was terrified of loving and losing again." Michael was the first to speak. "Why didn't you ever tell us?" he asked, his voice a mixture of hurt and wonder. Evelyn shook her head, regret etched in every line of her face. "I thought I was protecting you, and myself. I thought if I never spoke of it, never acknowledged it, I could pretend it hadn't happened. But I was wrong, so wrong, and I've paid for that mistake every day." Sarah moved to sit beside her mother, taking her hand. "Oh, Mom," she said softly. "What a terrible burden to carry all these years." Thomas, always the most reticent of her children, spoke up. Have you found her? Our sister?" Evelyn nodded, a small smile breaking through her tears. "Yes, her name is Grace. I met her last week. She's wonderful, and she's open to getting to know all of us if you're willing." The conversation that followed lasted well into the night. There were tears and recriminations, moments of anger and moments of profound understanding. Evelyn answered every question as honestly as she could, holding nothing back. And slowly, as the hours passed, she felt the walls between her and her children beginning to crumble. It wasn't a fairy tale ending. Years of hurt and misunderstanding couldn't be erased in a single night. But it was a beginning, a chance to rebuild on a foundation of truth and openness. As dawn broke, casting a soft light through the windows of the mansion, Evelyn looked at her children, all of her children, with new eyes. Michael, Sarah, and Thomas had agreed to meet Grace, to take the first tentative steps towards expanding their family. And Evelyn, for the first time in decades, felt the stirring of true happiness in her heart. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of emotion and activity. Evelyn threw herself into reconnecting with her children, making up for lost time with a fervor that surprised even her. She listened to their stories, shared in their joys and sorrows, and slowly began to rebuild the bonds that had been so badly damaged. Grace, true to her word, remained in touch. They spoke on the phone regularly, sharing more of their lives and getting to know each other better. And when the time felt right, they arranged for Grace to meet her siblings. The meeting took place at the mansion, which no longer felt cold and empty to Evelyn. As she watched her 4 children interact, awkwardly at first, then with growing warmth, she felt a sense of completion she had never known before. There were challenges, of course. Integrating Grace into the family dynamic wasn't always smooth. There were moments of jealousy, of confusion, of old hurts bubbling to the surface. But there were also moments of joy, of connection, of family bonds strengthening and expanding in ways none of them had expected. As months passed, Evelyn found herself transformed. The ice queen of the business world melted away, replaced by a woman who laughed more easily, loved more openly, and embraced life with a newfound vigor. She stepped back from her company, handing over the reins to Michael, who had inherited her business acumen but tempered it with a compassion she had long suppressed in herself. The mansion, once a symbol of her isolation, became a place of warmth and life. Family dinners became a regular occurrence, filled with laughter and the chaotic joy of grandchildren running through the halls. Evelyn delighted in her role as grandmother, determined to give her grandchildren the love and attention she had withheld from her own children for so long. Grace, while maintaining her own life and family in Ohio, became a regular visitor. She and Evelyn developed a relationship that, while not quite mother-daughter in the traditional sense, was deep and meaningful in its own unique way. And Grace's children, Evelyn's grandchildren she had never known, brought a new light into her life. As her 80th birthday approached, Evelyn found herself reflecting on the journey of the past few years. The woman who had once measured her worth in business deals and dollar signs now knew the true value of family, of love, of forgiveness. The celebration of her birthday was a far cry from the lonely affairs of years past. The mansion was filled to bursting with family and friends. laughter echoing through rooms that had once known only silence. As Evelyn looked around at the faces of her loved ones, Michael deepened conversation with Grace's husband. It can melt the coldest heart, bridge the widest gaps, and bring light to the darkest corners of our souls. As I write these words, I am filled with a peace I have never known before. The silent mansion is silent no more, and my heart, once locked away, now overflows with love for all of you. Whatever the future may hold, know that you have given this old woman the greatest gift of all, the chance to finally, truly live. With all my love, Evelyn. As she set down her pen, Evelyn felt a sense of completion. The journey wasn't over. There would always be new challenges, new joys, new opportunities for growth and love. But the shadows of the past no longer held sway over her. The silent mansion had found its voice, and Evelyn Harris had finally come home. Epilogue. 5 years later, on a warm summer evening, the Harris family gathered once again at the mansion. But this time, it was to say goodbye. Evelyn, surrounded by her children, grandchildren, and even a few great-grandchildren, slipped peacefully away, a contented smile on her face. In the days that followed, as the family sorted through her belongings, they found countless mementos of the life she had rebuilt in her final years. Photos of family gatherings, handwritten notes from grandchildren, even a few attempts at artwork inspired by her long-ago love, James. But it was the journal that touched them most deeply. Evelyn had continued to write in it until the very end, chronicling the joy she had found in her reunited family. The final entry, dated just days before her passing, read simply, "The silent mansion speaks, and its voice is love." As Michael, Sarah, Thomas, and Grace stood together in their mother's study, each holding a piece of the legacy she had left behind, they felt the truth of those words. The mansion, once a symbol of isolation and regret, now stood as a testament to the power of forgiveness, the strength of family bonds, and the enduring nature of love. And though Evelyn was gone, her spirit lived on in the laughter of her grandchildren, in the bonds between siblings once estranged, and in the lessons of love and redemption she had taught them all. The silent mansion would speak forevermore, its halls filled with the echoes of a family reunited, a love reclaimed, and a legacy of healing that would endure for generations to come.